The Runaways were once revered as the greatest all-female band of the 70s, the ultimate symbol of rebellion. But behind their fiery hits lay a perfectly disguised exploitation. 36-year-old impresario Kim Fowley manipulated 15-year-old girls, not for art, but to turn their provocative images into bait for the capitalist machine. The ultimate tragedy was New Year's Eve 1975. In the midst of a crowded party of music moguls, 16-year-old bassist Jackie Fox was ruthlessly destroyed. Dozens of people watched. No one stepped forward to intervene. The chilling silence that night marked the beginning of a ruthless cover-up campaign that lasted 40 years, where an entire music empire was willing to whitewash crimes and trample on victims to protect multi-million-dollar contracts. The roots of this tragedy trace back to the Sunset Strip. While recognized as the epicenter of the music business, beneath the neon, it operated as a hunting ground for unprotected talent. Fowley was a fringe figure in this world, a hustler who had spent years hovering on the edges of fame, writing novelty songs and managing minor acts. He recognized that the industry was primarily selling a specific image to a demographic of aging men, exposing a highly profitable gap in the market. Existing all-girl bands were usually polished and polite. He wanted something completely raw. He wanted inexperienced artists playing hard rock. Fowley appeared less interested in technical polish than in building a marketable image around early career performers he could tightly control. Several of the members were extremely young and inexperienced, and the imbalance of age, power, and control around the band was severe from the beginning. Jackie Fox fit this demographic perfectly. She was a bright, mathematically gifted young artist. Like many newcomers in the Los Angeles rock scene, she was looking for an identity and a place to belong. What emerged was a structure in which the group was treated less like developing artists and more like a product to be shaped and sold. Fowley's approach to recruitment was not based on mentoring through kindness. Manipulative figures often use gifts and affection to lower a person's defenses. Fowley used a different tactic. He used toxicity and intimidation. From the very first auditions, he established a dynamic of absolute authority. He was the gatekeeper to their dreams. If they wanted to be stars, they had to submit entirely to his vision, his rules, and his harsh management. He gathered these talents and immediately began to strip away their individual identities. They were no longer regular students. They were commodities. Fowley realized early on that controlling 5 young artists could be difficult if they formed a strong bond. If they became friends, they might share information. If they shared information, they might realize they were being taken advantage of. They might unite against him. To prevent this, Fowley implemented a strict, militaristic strategy of psychological pressure. He had to ensure that the band members remained fractured, isolated, and entirely dependent on him for their sense of worth. He began laying the groundwork for an environment so hostile and competitive that they would view each other as enemies rather than allies. The band's early structure depended heavily on pressure, control, and the vulnerability of inexperienced performers. The psychological pressure began the moment the group stepped into the rehearsal space. Kim Fowley did not provide a safe environment for artistic expression. The rehearsal environment appears to have been harsh, humiliating, and emotionally destabilizing. He stood in the center of the room and dictated the emotional weather. He used humiliation as his primary teaching tool. If a member missed a chord or a vocal cue, he did not offer guidance. He stopped the music. He singled her out in front of the others. He hurled insults designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. He mocked their appearance. He mocked their intelligence. He mocked their lack of worldly experience. He used aggressive, vulgar language to shock and intimidate them. He wanted them off balance. He wanted them terrified of making a mistake. He knew that a group of newcomers facing a hostile manager would naturally band together for protection. Friendship was a threat to his authority. He actively sabotaged any emerging solidarity among the band members. He implemented a classic divide and conquer strategy. He would pull the lead guitarist aside and whisper that the singer was plotting to replace her. He would tell the drummer that the bass player was untalented and holding the entire project back. He planted seeds of paranoia in developing minds. The performers were young. They lacked the life experience to recognize that their realities were being systematically dismantled. They believed him. The rehearsal room transformed into hostile territory where everyone was a potential enemy. They stopped trusting each other. They stopped confiding in each other. When Fowley verbally attacked one member, the others did not intervene. They stayed silent, relieved that the crosshairs were not on them. This was exactly what Fowley engineered. He created an atomized group of dependents. They were isolated from their families and alienated from each other. The only person they could look to for validation was their controlling manager. With their psychological defenses dismantled, Fowley moved to the next phase of control. He commodified their physical appearances. The music was secondary to the visual package. Fowley understood exactly what he was selling. He forced the group to abandon their normal, comfortable clothing. He ordered them to throw away their jeans and t-shirts. He replaced them with corsets, suspenders, fishnet tights, and leather. These were not outfits designed mainly for comfort or musical performance. They were chosen to heighten provocation and image. A 36-year-old man was directing how very young performers should dress, pose, and present themselves in public. He coached them to project a deliberately provocative persona, not for their own empowerment, but for commercial effect. Fowley marketed the band in ways that emphasized their inexperience and vulnerability. He knew exactly who that image was designed to attract. This was not primarily about giving audiences positive role models. It was about drawing older male attention through a deliberately aggressive presentation. The live shows reinforced that imbalance. Many of the men attending the early club dates were much older than the band members. The image being sold was clearly designed to attract that audience, and the artists were left to perform under the gaze of an older crowd without meaningful protection from management. The person encouraging the spectacle was the same man controlling the band. The music press bought the narrative completely. This is where the complicity of the industry began to solidify. Music journalists framed the unconventional outfits and the aggressive posturing as a bold feminist statement. They called the group trailblazers, taking ownership of their image. Magazine editors published photos of young artists in corsets and labeled it a cultural revolution. The band members themselves were fed this lie. Fowley convinced them that wearing unconventional stage outfits was an act of rebellion against a conservative society. In reality, It was total compliance with the most regressive, inappropriate demands of an older audience. The group thought they were rebelling against the establishment. They were actually just working on a highly profitable assembly line, designed by a middle-aged operator. The press provided the intellectual cover for an operation that manipulated newcomers. By calling it art and rebellion, the journalists allowed the industry to consume the image of young performers without guilt. Control is ultimately maintained through economics. The group worked grueling hours. They rehearsed endlessly. They played late-night club shows. They were generating revenue, but they saw very little of it. Fowley controlled the purse strings with absolute authority. He owned the intellectual property. He owned the band name. He took the lion's share of the publishing rights. He paid the group a meager allowance. It was barely enough to cover basic survival needs like fast food. When they asked for an accounting of the money or requested a fair share of their earnings, Fowley erupted in rage. He called them ungrateful. He reminded them that before he found them, they were nothing. He convinced them that they owed him their entire careers. By keeping them perpetually broke, he ensured they could not leave. An artist without money cannot hire a lawyer to review a highly unbalanced contract. An artist without money cannot secure alternative housing to escape a toxic environment. They were economically trapped. They were generating wealth for the adults around them while living on scraps. Jackie Fox entered this machine as a smart, capable young woman. She had been a straight-A student with a bright future. Fowley recognized her intelligence immediately. He did not view her intellect as an asset to the band. He viewed it as a threat to his control. Smart people ask questions. Smart people read contracts. He targeted Jackie specifically to break her confidence. He constantly criticized her bass playing. He mocked her appearance relentlessly. He made her feel entirely disposable. He constantly threatened to fire her and bring in a replacement. This relentless psychological pressure degraded her mental well-being. She was living in a perpetual state of stress. The ambitious, intelligent artist was slowly being ground down into a compliant, terrified employee. Fowley needed them exhausted. He booked back-to-back shows, grueling travel schedules, and endless promotional appearances. Sleep deprivation is a standard tactic used in high-control groups to break down resistance. Fowley applied the same principle to his band. The group was overworked, underfed, and constantly stressed. They relied on whatever coping mechanisms they could find. The rock and roll environment provided easy access to detrimental habits. Fowley did not protect them from these elements. An impaired, exhausted employee is an easily controlled employee. The adult ecosystem surrounding the band watched this happen. Sound engineers, roadies, booking agents, and record label executives interacted with the band daily. They saw the verbal hostility. They saw the exhaustion. They saw the inappropriate marketing forced upon young talent. They knew the group was not being paid fairly. Nobody intervened. The adults justified their silence. They told themselves that this was just how the music business operated. They told themselves that Fowley was a difficult genius, and this was his process. They prioritized the creation of hit records and the generation of revenue over the safety of the young people in their care. The normalization of mistreatment had permeated the entire industry. The adults had built a system where exploiting a newcomer was considered a standard business practice as long as the record went gold. The stage was set for a catastrophe. Fowley had successfully isolated the band, commodified their appearances, and ensured the complicity of the surrounding adults. He had created an environment where he operated with absolute impunity. He pushed the boundaries of control further every day, testing the limits of what the industry would tolerate. He found that there were no limits. The adults would look away from anything if the price was right. This total lack of accountability paved the way for the deeply troubling events that would occur at the end of the year. The psychological and economic manipulation was merely the prelude to the severe breach of trust that was to come. It was New Year's Eve, 1975. The location was an after-party in an Orange County hotel room. It was supposed to be a celebration. The Runaways had just finished a gig. They were gaining traction. The industry buzz was growing. The executives in suits were smelling the money. They gathered in the room to drink, to network, and to revel in the early success of their new product. The young band members were present. They were the trophies. They were the focal points. Kim Fowley was holding court. He was the center of attention, the eccentric figure who had struck gold. The room was crowded. It was filled with industry professionals. There were executives from Mercury Records. There were managers. There were booking agents. There were musicians from other bands. These were people of means. These were people with authority, education, and social standing. The atmosphere was heavily uninhibited and chaotic. Drinks flowed freely, and the environment quickly became intensely disorienting. Fowley fostered an atmosphere where boundaries were entirely dissolved. This setting was profoundly unsafe. In such a volatile space, the basic norms of professional conduct vanished. It turned the environment into a place of extreme vulnerability. It wiped out normal defenses. It rendered the attendees entirely unprotected. Fowley dictated the terms of the gathering. Jackie Fox was an early career artist. She was exhausted from the tour schedule and worn down by months of verbal hostility. She found herself in a highly compromising situation without fully understanding the risks. Surrounded by industry professionals in the room, she assumed there would be some basic level of safety. That assumption would collapse within minutes. The situation escalated quickly. The room became chaotic. Her ability to navigate the environment faded. She lost the capacity to respond or protect herself. She was left completely overwhelmed and vulnerable in a space filled with older professionals. Fox's later recollections paint a harrowing picture. The catastrophic breach of boundaries did not unfold in secret. Once she was incapacitated by the chaotic environment, the transgression occurred right there in the room, with multiple people nearby. What makes the event especially disturbing is the silence around it. Dozens of industry professionals witnessed the transgression, yet no one intervened. Whether out of fear or self-interest, their collective failure to act solidified Fowley's absolute control. He was demonstrating to the room that he owned the product completely and no one would stop him. When it was over, the party simply continued, leaving Fox entirely unprotected in a deeply unsafe environment. The morning after, Jackie Fox woke to the reality of what had happened and looked for help from the people around the band. She was in deep distress and in desperate need of support. But what followed was not a visible effort to pursue accountability. Instead, the figures with power appeared more focused on containing the fallout around the band than on protecting the young artist at the center of the allegation. Pressure and silence took over quickly. The younger band members were in no position to challenge the adults controlling their careers, and fear appears to have played a major role in keeping the story buried. The message was clear enough. Speaking openly could destroy the band, end the contracts, and erase the future they had been promised. In that environment, silence became part of the damage, and the consequences of that silence would last for years. Fox was left in an environment where the figures with power did not protect her, and the people around her were unable or unwilling to challenge that structure. She asked for help, but the environment around the band offered little sign of protection or urgency. Instead of being removed from the situation and properly supported, she was expected to continue performing, remain publicly composed, and keep moving forward within the same structure she later said had failed her. The contradiction was devastating. She was being marketed to the public as a symbol of female rebellion, while privately living with untreated distress inside a toxic environment. The damage from the New Year's Eve allegation did not stop there. It deepened over time, while the band continued moving forward and the management failed to meaningfully change course. The trauma remained unaddressed. After New Year's Eve, Jackie Fox continued appearing on stage and fulfilling the demands of the band, but internally she was struggling with the lasting effects of what she said had happened. The contradiction in her daily life was extreme. Night after night, she was expected to step into the spotlight and project confidence, aggression, and control for the audience. The band's image demanded that performance. At the same time, she remained trapped inside a structure still shaped by the same man she later accused, a man who continued to influence the band's money, schedule, and direction. She was living inside a public image that no longer matched her private reality. As the band gained momentum through recording sessions and international touring, there was little space for recovery and no meaningful pause in the schedule. The business kept moving, and Jackie was carried along with it. The breaking point arrived in the summer of 1977. The Runaways traveled to Japan. The Japanese tour was a phenomenon. The band was greeted with a level of hysteria that rivaled Beatlemania. Thousands of screaming fans mobbed the airports. Fans chased their cars through the streets of Tokyo. The Runaways were treated like absolute royalty. They appeared on national television. They played sold-out arenas. The external world was screaming their names in total adoration. Behind the sold-out arenas and screaming fans, Fox's mental stability collapsed. The massive disconnect between the screaming fans and her internal desolation finally shattered her coping mechanisms. She looked out at the sea of adoring faces and felt completely fraudulent. They were cheering for a manufactured idol. They had no idea they were screaming for an overwhelmed, exhausted young artist who was being strictly controlled by her management and her record label. The sheer volume of the fame only magnified her profound isolation. She could not speak to the fans. She could not speak to the Japanese promoters. She was surrounded by thousands of people, yet she had never been more utterly alone. The emotional despair consumed her. The schedule was brutal. The physical exhaustion compounded the psychological pressure. Fowley's verbal hostility had not stopped. It had only intensified with the pressure of a massive international tour. The environment was toxic, paranoid, and suffocating. Jackie could no longer function. The survival instinct that had kept her moving since the incident finally gave out. She simply wanted the noise to stop. She wanted to erase the memory. She wanted to escape the machine. In a Tokyo hotel room, isolated despite the deafening roar of international success, Jackie Fox reached a catastrophic breaking point, sparking a desperate, final attempt to escape the machine entirely. It was a profound crisis point for an artist in deep distress. It was a tragic cry for help from a talent who had been systematically failed by every authority figure in her orbit. She survived the critical breakdown, but the reaction from the corporate apparatus was chilling. When a young performer experiences such a severe crisis while on a major international tour, a normal human response involves immediate medical intervention, psychological support, and a complete cessation of work. Mercury Records and Kim Fowley did not operate on human empathy. They operated on profit margins. They did not view Jackie as a person in critical danger. They viewed her as a defective piece of inventory. Rather than pausing to address her condition with meaningful care, the band and its management moved forward without her. Instead of receiving protection or recovery time, Jackie was removed from the band. The manner of her departure was abrupt and deeply damaging. They did not gently phase her out. They cut her loose with surgical precision. She was in a foreign country, traumatized, recovering from a severe breakdown, and they simply severed the professional relationship. They put her on an airplane back to Los Angeles. She was sent home alone. She was discarded. The band moved on quickly, replacing her and continuing its schedule. The Runaways still had tour dates to fulfill. Fowley immediately brought in a replacement. He hired a new performer named Vicky Blue to play the bass. He strapped a guitar to her, put her in the requisite provocative clothing, and pushed her onto the stage. The machine barely skipped a beat. The fans kept cheering. The records kept selling. The replacement made clear how little protection or security the band's young members actually had. Jackie Fox was wiped from the active roster of the band she had helped build. She was thrown back into civilian life, left to deal with the catastrophic psychological fallout of her mistreatment entirely on her own, without a shred of financial or emotional support from the industry that had chewed her up. For many survivors in the 1970s, the legal system offered little realistic path to justice, especially in cases shaped by power imbalance, distress, and delayed reporting. Jackie Fox ran headfirst into a brutal legal mechanism known as the Statute of Limitations. The Statute of Limitations is a law that sets the maximum time after an event within which legal proceedings may be initiated. It operates on a ticking clock. If the clock runs out, the act effectively ceases to exist in the eyes of the court. The perpetrator is granted absolute permanent immunity. The rationale behind the law is to prevent the prosecution of stale claims where evidence might be lost or memories might fade. In reality, it serves as an impenetrable shield for controlling figures who hold positions of power over vulnerable individuals. The music industry executives who ignored the New Year's Eve incident understood this clock perfectly. They did not need to keep Jackie Fox quiet forever. They only needed to keep her quiet long enough for the statute of limitations to expire. Their strategy of intimidation and isolation was calculated against this legal deadline. They knew she was inexperienced. They knew she was terrified of destroying her friends' careers. They knew she was psychologically paralyzed. They relied on that paralysis. They banked on the distress keeping her silent until the legal window slammed shut. Their calculation was flawless. Furthermore, the social climate of the justice system at that time provided a hostile environment for a young person in her position. If an early career artist walked into a Los Angeles police precinct in 1976 and claimed a famous music producer mistreated her, the reaction would have been catastrophic. The detectives would look at her stage costumes. They would look at the corsets and the leather. They would look at the rock and roll lifestyle, the late nights, and the presence of chaotic elements at the party. The defense attorneys would not argue the facts of the misconduct. They would put the victim on trial. They would deploy the concept of the assumption of risk. They would argue that an artist who chooses to participate in the chaotic, highly volatile world of rock music implicitly consents to its dangers. They would paint her as a willing participant in a chaotic lifestyle who simply regretted a poorly judged encounter. A performer who played heavy metal in suggestive clothing was the exact opposite of the perfect victim the legal system demanded. A trial would have been a public crucifixion. Faced with the insurmountable wall of the statute of limitations and a hostile legal culture, Jackie Fox had no avenue for justice. The law told her that her distress had an expiration date. The industry told her that her pain was irrelevant. She was forced to swallow the atrocity and carry it alone. While she struggled to rebuild a fractured psyche, Kim Fowley faced almost no professional consequences. He continued to operate freely within the music industry. He produced new bands, he negotiated new contracts, he walked into VIP rooms and was greeted with handshakes and drinks. The professionals who had watched him mistreat a young artist continued to do business with him. His career trajectory was completely uninterrupted. The absolute lack of accountability validated his actions. The system proved to him that he was untouchable. Jackie Fox refused to become a permanent casualty. If the music industry viewed her as a disposable commodity, she would forge an identity in an arena where intellect, not compliance, was the currency. She channeled her survival instinct into academia. She possessed a brilliant mind, and she decided to weaponize it. She completely abandoned the persona of a rock star. She enrolled in college. She studied relentlessly. She secured excellent grades. She applied to the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. She was accepted into Harvard University. She traded the chaotic, unstable darkness of the Sunset Strip for the structured, rigorous halls of the Ivy League. She became a student of the law. The young artist who was fundamentally betrayed by the legal system dedicated her adult life to mastering its intricacies. She became an attorney. She built a fortress of education and professional respectability around herself. She created a life that was insulated from the whims of men like Kim Fowley. She survived, she adapted, and she succeeded on her own terms. But professional success does not erase historical distress. As Jackie Fox built her new life, the legacy of the Runaways began to mutate. The band ultimately collapsed in the late 70s, fracturing under the weight of the toxic environment Fowley had created. However, As the 1980s and 90s progressed, the individual members achieved massive solo success. Joan Jett became a global rock icon. Lita Ford became a heavy metal superstar. Because of their subsequent fame, the origin story of the Runaways was constantly revisited by the media. The narrative was entirely revised. The music press, desperate for feminist icons in the aggressive rock genre, retroactively hailed the band as pioneers. Documentaries were produced, books were written, the story was sanitized and packaged for public consumption. The narrative largely omitted the manipulation. The band was presented as a group of fiercely independent artists who took on the male establishment and won. Kim Fowley's role was heavily romanticized. He was continuously portrayed as the eccentric mastermind, the bizarre but necessary catalyst who brought these brilliant talents together. The journalists lauded his visionary marketing tactics. They celebrated his abrasive personality as authenticity. The dark, highly questionable reality of his management style was brushed off as mere rock and roll excess. Jackie Fox had to watch this revisionist history take root and become accepted historical fact. Every time a magazine published a retrospective praising the Runaways' feminist legacy, it was a slap in the face. Every time Kim Fowley was interviewed and treated with reverence, it was a reopening of the wound. She was forced to live in a world that aggressively celebrated her former manager and commodified the darkest period of her life. The ultimate whitewashing of the tragedy occurred in 2010. Hollywood decided to turn the myth into a major motion picture. A major studio produced a biographical film simply titled The Runaways. It starred A-list Hollywood actresses. The film was heavily promoted as a gritty, authentic look at the band's rise to fame. In reality, it was the final layer of concrete poured over the truth. The filmmakers approached the former band members for their life rights. Jackie Fox refused. She read the script and recognized the lie. She refused to sign her name to a project that glorified a highly manipulative figure. Because she withheld her rights, the filmmakers simply erased her. They removed Jackie Fox from the history of the band. They created a fictional composite bass player to take her place on screen. The industry once again proved that if you do not comply with the narrative, you will be replaced. The portrayal of Kim Fowley in the film was the most offensive element of all. The movie depicted him as a quirky, loud, aggressive, but ultimately harmless and brilliant manager. He was played for comedic relief. The provocative marketing of the young performers was presented as a cheeky strategy. The verbal hostility was portrayed as tough love. The severe professional misconduct and boundary violations were completely omitted. The film premiered to red carpets and critical acclaim. Millions of new fans watched the movie and believed they knew the story of the Runaways. The cinematic lie cemented Kim Fowley's legacy as a cultural icon. The industry had successfully completed the total sanitation of a dark history. For nearly 40 years, Jackie Fox watched the industry publicly celebrate the man who had exploited her. She watched the enablers age comfortably. She watched the executives retire with massive pensions. She watched her former manager continue to give interviews, write memoirs, and bask in the glow of a manufactured legacy. The injustice calcified. The statute of limitations had long since expired. The legal avenue was permanently closed. The press was entirely complicit in the myth-making. There was no court of law that would hear her case. There was no police detective who would knock on Kim Fowley's door. The system had worked perfectly for the controlling figure, but the statute of limitations only applies to the courtroom. It does not apply to the truth. As the year 2015 approached, the cultural landscape was beginning to shift. The whispers of institutional failures in various industries were starting to gain volume. The protective walls around powerful men were starting to show hairline fractures. Jackie Fox realized that while the law could not hold Kim Fowley accountable, history still could. She realized that maintaining her silence was no longer an act of self-preservation. It was an act of complicity with the very machine that had compromised her. She possessed the only weapon capable of dismantling a 40-year-old lie. She had her voice, and she had the truth. The era of the bystander was coming to an end. The time had come to set the record straight, regardless of the fallout. The year 2015 marked a permanent rupture in the carefully constructed mythology of 1970s rock and roll. The protective silence that had shielded powerful men in the entertainment industry was finally beginning to fracture. Jackie Fox understood that breaking a 40-year-old industry cover-up required more than just an accusation. It required a bulletproof presentation of facts. She was no longer a terrified young bass player manipulated by record executives. She was a seasoned attorney. She knew that the music press would immediately attempt to dismiss her claims as the bitter fabrications of a former band member. To defeat the machine, she had to bypass the music press entirely. She did not take her story to Rolling Stone or any other publication that had spent decades canonizing Kim Fowley. She went to the Huffington Post. She engaged with investigative journalists who were not intoxicated by rock and roll nostalgia. She knew that her own testimony, while truthful, would be subjected to intense scrutiny. The industry defense strategy always relies on isolating the individual and reducing the act to a dispute over memory. Jackie Fox preempted this strategy by doing the one thing the record label executives thought was impossible. She tracked down the bystanders. She located the people who were in that Orange County hotel room on New Year's Eve in 1975. She found the professionals who had stood with drinks in their hands and watched an early career artist be irrevocably mistreated. For 4 decades, these individuals had lived with the corrosive guilt of their own silence. Some of them were still working in the industry. Some had moved on. Confronted with the reality of the individual they had abandoned, the pact of silence finally broke. Several eyewitnesses went on the record, largely corroborating the core details of the misconduct. They confirmed the highly compromising environment. They confirmed the identity of the perpetrator. Most importantly, they confirmed the presence of the crowd. The publication of the Huffington Post article was a seismic event. It was a meticulously researched, legally vetted dismantling of a cultural icon. The article did not merely expose Kim Fowley as a highly destructive figure. It exposed the entire operational model of the Runaways as a profoundly unethical enterprise, disguised as a feminist milestone. The impact was devastating because it stripped away the illusion of rebellion. The public was forced to confront the reality that the aggressive, independent image of the band was a marketing strategy built on the systematic physical and psychological manipulation of young performers. The backlash was immediate, but the target of the public outrage was not confined to Fowley alone. The true weight of the article lay in its exposure of the bystander effect. The public was sickened by the revelation that dozens of industry professionals had witnessed the incident and actively chosen to protect the investment over the artist. The article indicted Mercury Records. It indicted the management team. It indicted the music journalists who had spent decades writing glowing profiles of a man they knew to be highly destructive. Jackie Fox forced the entire music industry to look at its own reflection, and the image was grim. However, the moral victory was accompanied by a staggering, bitter injustice. The timing of the publication highlighted the ultimate cruelty of the timeline. Kim Fowley never read the article. He never faced the public reckoning. He never saw his carefully curated legacy burn to the ground. In January 2015, just months before the Huffington Post investigation was published, Kim Fowley died of bladder cancer. He was 75 years old. He passed away in comfort, surrounded by the wealth he had extracted from young artists, completely evading any public reckoning while the music press published glowing obituaries celebrating his eccentric genius. The industry mourned him. Radio stations played tributes to him. He slipped away entirely untouched by consequence. The statute of limitations had protected him in life, and mortality shielded him from the final judgment. He escaped the reckoning by a matter of weeks. The death of the manager before the revelation of the truth left a profound void. There would be no trial. There would be no cross-examination. There would be no moment where Jackie Fox could stand in a courtroom, look the man in the eye, and watch a judge hand down a sentence. The satisfaction of a legal conviction was permanently denied to her. The public had to grapple with the disturbing reality that a man could commit horrific professional acts in plain sight, boast about his control of youth, and still die a celebrated figure in American pop culture. The fallout from the article tore through the remaining legacy of the band. The other former members of the Runaways were forced to publicly confront the nightmare they had been coerced into hiding. Joan Jett and Lita Ford had to navigate the impossible terrain of having their foundational origin story exposed as a deeply troubling reality. The executives who had pressured them into silence had effectively turned the individuals against each other. The trauma of the misconduct was compounded by the trauma of the forced complicity. Fowley's strategy of divide and conquer proved to be his most enduring and destructive creation. He had successfully planted landmines in their relationships that detonated 40 years later. The story of the Runaways is not an isolated anomaly. It is simply the darkest, most visible blueprint of a predatory machine that has defined the entertainment industry for decades. The capitalist machinery of music often relies on the rapid consumption of youth. The industry aggressively recruits the young, the naive, and the vulnerable because they are the most malleable to acquire and the easiest to control. The rebellion that is sold to the consumer is almost always a highly managed product. The teenage artist screaming about independence into a microphone is usually contractually bound to a corporation that dictates her wardrobe, her schedule, and her financial survival. When a system is designed to prioritize profit above all ethical considerations, human beings can be reduced to inventory. Inventory does not have human rights. When a piece of inventory is damaged, whether by physical harm or psychological collapse, the system is not programmed to halt production and repair the damage. It is programmed to hide the defect, extract whatever value remains, and replace the unit. The music executives in 1975 did not view the severe mistreatment of a young artist as a moral atrocity. They viewed it as a logistical complication. Their only goal was to ensure the complication did not interfere with the album release schedule. This corporate detachment is enabled entirely by the crowd. The controlling figure relies on the silence of the room. Kim Fowley knew he could mistreat an artist in front of his peers because he knew exactly what those peers valued. He knew they valued their paychecks, their access to the VIP sections, and their proximity to fame more than they valued the physical safety of a young performer. He weaponized their ambition against their morality, and he won. The ultimate tragedy is not just that a highly manipulative figure existed. Such figures exist in every industry. The tragedy is that a system of functioning, educated adults built a protective wall around him and handed him the keys to a room full of young talent. The legacy of Jackie Fox is an act of supreme defiance. She refused to remain the discarded inventory. She refused to let a corporate machine dictate the ending of her story. By stepping into the light and forcing the industry to acknowledge its failures, she dismantled the myth of the rebel manager and replaced it with the grim reality of severe industry manipulation. She reclaimed her narrative from the journalists who had tried to erase her. We can no longer listen to the music of that era without hearing the horrific cost of its production. The driving bass lines and the aggressive vocals are permanently overlaid with the memory of an industry party. The history of rock and roll is littered with the casualties of its own mythology. The industry demands absolute sacrifice, and it prefers that sacrifice to be made in silence. The incident in that Orange County hotel room was not an anomaly. It was the byproduct of a system that prioritized profit over protection. The men and women who stood there and watched a young artist be mistreated chose to be complicit. Their silence was the active ingredient that allowed the manipulation to continue. They are the true enablers of this history. They prove that destruction does not always operate in the shadows. Sometimes it operates in the center of a brightly lit room, surrounded by people who simply decide it is too inconvenient to look away from the party. The music eventually fades. The applause always dies down, but the silence of those bystanders echoes forever.